Rumors abound that a new Tyranid Codex for Warhammer 40,000 9th edition is on its way. And, let's be real, rumors always abound, but that shouldn't stop us from practicing some baseless speculation and talking about what we could expect from a new 9th edition Tyranid Codex. What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be talking about some Tyranids. And today I just wanted to kind of take it easy, sit back in my computer chair a little bit, and engage in some absolute crap shooting as we take a look at the recent codexes that have released and what they might herald for a Tyranid Codex in the not-too-distant future. Apparently, I've relaxed back in my chair enough that I've fallen entirely to the bottom of the sea because I sound like I'm underwater. Unfortunately, the rattle in my microphone came back. I'm not sure how to make it go away, but the best I could do was making myself sound like I am talking through a mask. So, I apologize for that in advance, and greetings from beneath the depths of the briny sea. The intention isn't really to do like a wish list here. Maybe I'll wish list a little bit in this video, but mostly I'd like to take a realistic look at, I think, what we can expect out of a new codex, given Games Workshop's most recent design trends. Over the course of this video, I'll start off with some general rules I think we can expect, as well as matched play stuff, and then I'll talk about some of the smaller bugs, our troops choices, and infantry, before moving on to what I think we can look forward to in the larger models. There's a lot to glean from the recent codexes that have come out. We've seen a lot of consistent rules trends in these new books, so in my opinion, a lot of the stuff can be extrapolated out pretty well to talk about some of the existing factions and how they may get a nice glow up. So first off, starting with some general rules. In 9th edition and early 8th edition, basically every army started to get a combat doctrine style rule that would benefit you additionally for not souping your army. So your detachments would get their specific benefits from your faction abilities and your sub-faction traits, but if you took all of a single faction, you'd get something like a super doctrine. Sisters of Battle get their Rights of War. Necrons get their command protocol. Necrons can't soup, but you get what I'm saying. Tyranids are, they're technically a super faction. There's 3 separate factions that you can include in with them, so giving you an additional incentive not to soup them together makes a ton of sense to me. You can put Tyranids together with Genestealer Cult, and if you have Genestealer Cult, you can then also put Astra Militarum in. And while I think Games Workshop is probably more okay with Tyranid souping than maybe Imperial souping, which gets really messy, I do think that the trend of incentivizing people to take all of one faction is going to continue. Now, what this bonus looks like for Tyranids, I do not know. I sort of imagine this is where adaptive physiologies are going. I have a sneaking suspicion that we're going to be seeing a lot of the mechanics brought forward in Psychic Awakening to act as sort of a stopgap for the old version of codexes and bring them up to speed with the new version of codexes. Those are going to be retooled and reworked into an entirely different mechanic, and I think that's where an adaptive physiology style ability is going to be. Maybe you get some mutable bonuses like Sacred Rights and Sisters of Battle that are changeable from game to game, and you get to pick those for particular units before the game. I think that would be cool if maybe adaptive physiologies were just, you get 3 of them in a Strike Force game, and if you're unsouped and you can just pick 3 units to get one of the list, I think that would be awesome and really captures the spirit of what adaptive physiologies are supposed to be, which is a mutable adaptation that Tyranids are able to make to their troops on the field or as they spawn them so that they can adapt better to their opponents. We may also see a buff like this come into play in a similar manner to what Games Workshop has envisioned Tyranids as in other media, mostly video games. And in a lot of video games, Tyranids are, they're horde-centric, but they're also buff-centric that tend to layer multiple aura area of effect abilities over top their units. Their units tend to be relatively weak, but once you stack all these abilities on top of them, it makes them hit super hard way above their weight class. And I would be surprised if that wasn't the direction a new codex would go in. This could take the place of a rework to Synapse. Instead of Synapse just being an aura that keeps your guys in line, Synapse creatures could have particular abilities maybe that overlap on each other. Kind of an opposite version of the Death Guard Contagion auras, just instead of debuffing enemies in the aura effect, they have positive effects to friendly units. Given the structure of Warhammer 40k, this is a lot harder to make work effectively on the tabletop than it is in a video game, and that's probably the reason that we haven't really seen Tyranids go this direction in 8th edition, but I do think that with the design sensibilities that the team is clearly showcasing in their 9th edition codexes, it is a distinct possibility. Dovetailing into that point, the new codexes in 9th edition are getting this core rework where the core keyword is being given out to units that are central to either the conceptual or the mechanical function of a faction, and those units get the most benefit out of your aura abilities and your stratagems. A lot of things target core stuff specifically. I have no idea how that's going to hit Tyranids. Conceptually, Tyranids aren't really an army that's organized in that way. Unlike Space Marines, Tyranids don't have interceptor squads versus Centurion squads, so you could give core to infantry, but Tyranids, I imagine, would tend to treat all of their infantry the same, at least from a lore standpoint. Like, for example, it wouldn't really make sense to me if Raveners, for example, were not core while Tyranid warriors were, given that Raveners are basically just Tyranid warriors that don't have stamps, but they burrow instead. That would kind of look odd to me. That said, I sort of also felt that way about Necrons, and Necrons got absolutely random core keywords sprinkled all over their codex, and no one can make sense of it, so I have to imagine something similar happens to Tyranids, which would be unfortunate. It seems to me like probably just seemingly random data sheets will get it tacked on. The stuff that doesn't have it will be very difficult to get played. Fortunately, maybe if that works with sort of a more aura-centric version of the faction, that could be okay. For example, I think if anything in the faction were to not get the core keyword, it would be Gene Stealers, given that conceptually, which seems to be how Games Workshop is attaching the keyword to units, Gene Stealers are meant to operate independently from the rest of the army, so they go and do their own thing. But Broodlords and other similar HQ choices would still have auras that specifically affect Gene Stealers, which makes you play, little Gene Stealer modules in your list just fine. So if that's how it ends up being restructured, that makes a ton of sense to me. Obviously, you can't key Synapse to core or something like that. It doesn't work on all of your aura abilities, so it is a weird concept when it comes to Tyranids, but we'll just have to see how it goes. If they do end up building a lot of aura abilities into the faction, it may just be that core is affected by those aura abilities, and that's how they kind of break it up, but we'll see. I also have a feeling that the current strength of Tyranids, which is some extreme mobility and extreme threat ranges, gets hamstrung significantly. It seems like that's one of the directions that GW is trying to go with 9th edition. They're trying to sort of make it a little bit more tactile, a little bit more straight up 40k. You're not trying to combo off with these big flashy, double move plus opportunistic advance into a big charge using synaptic lure, hyper combos to alpha strike your opponent off the table. They're trying to make it a little bit more bare bones. So if you like your Swarmlord and you like your metabolic overdrives, just be prepared, because I think those are going to get nerfed into the ground. I imagine any double move abilities that survive will most likely end up being a static move. We saw this in Ravenwing. The Ravenwing double move ability changed from just moving again without your advance roll to just moving an additional 12 inches, which was a significant nerf. It also required you to advance in order to trigger it the first time, and I imagine that's what we see if Metabolic Overdrive ends up staying in the faction. I think what happens is that we get a stratagem that, for example, allows a unit to advance, then move an additional 8 inches after the advance. I think that's probably what we see. That would mean that you can't perform actions afterwards, which honestly to me, it's really good as a Tyranid player. It's really strong to be able to Metabolic Overdrive your unit and walk twice and perform an action, but that does feel a little bit unintended to me. And while I do imagine that, given that a lot of other factions are getting the ability to perform actions while doing other stuff, Tyranids will probably get the ability to perform actions while being mobile. I don't think that, double moving is going to be the way forward to get your scramblers off, for example. Hive Commander, I can also see being removed or significantly reduced. Maybe it turns into a 6-inch move, so you can't, double move your Flying Hive Tyrants, double move your hovering Harridans, go 40 inches and then charge. That's a little bit extreme. I imagine that it becomes a command phase buff a la Chapter Master that maybe gives plus 2 inches to move for a unit. Maybe it's similar to the Necron Aura that gives everything +1. I think that is much more likely a style of ability we're going to see. And similarly, Overrun probably gets turned into a static move. Something like Fire and Fade from Eldari. You just fight. If you kill your opponent, you get to move, 8 inches or 6 inches or something like that. Honestly, probably still fine, but not quite as hypermobile as the faction is currently. If you are a Tyranid player right now and you're really getting off on that hypermobility, the ability to play this high hit-and-run finesse game, I have to imagine that that's going to be going away, so enjoy it while you can. Lastly, some matched play stuff. I'm going to throw some random concepts out here for potential secondary objectives that Tyranids might get. I mentioned probably something for killing characters. In the fluff, Tyranids do that a lot for some reason, and also in 8th edition and in 8th edition Codex, they are highly incentivized to go for characters, especially with Gene Stealers and Lictors. I mean, we have 3 entire strains of organisms that are designed specifically to wipe out the enemy leadership. That has to spiral into something, I think, on the tabletop. If it's like a duel style secondary, where you pick an enemy character and you have to kill it with your character to get the max points, those are basically garbage. I can't imagine something like that being particularly playable, but it might be in there for fluff reasons. I think a battlefield supremacy or maybe shadow ops that eats objectives, basically like Scorched Earth, the Scorched Earth mission specific secondary, or I guess the Scorched Earth action that allows you to destroy objectives, and then the secondary that scores you off of them, something like that potentially, just to represent Tyranids being kind of all consuming. Being able to pull objectives off the table would be really cool. It's very difficult typically, so that's usually a little bit odd. If you make it too easy, it becomes really, really gross to play against. But maybe you can like eat an objective in your own deployment zone for 15 points or something on your secondary, and then you don't score that for the rest of the game, but you do, max one of your secondaries. That could be cool. Incentivizes more of an aggressive style while being kind of really consuming, sort of a self-destructive style of secondary objective, which I think fits right into the background of the faction. And lastly, maybe something about outnumbering your opponent. So a Warrior Pride-esque secondary where if you have a 1 unit or 2 units that have more models in them than the units they're engaging with, maybe you get 3 points or something like that. I could see that happening. It seems to me like Games Workshop wants to incentivize kind of old school OG style Tyranids where you're playing a big backbone of warriors with a smattering of the big bugs to add some punch, but then sort of carpets of the little guys to, really hold down the table. That's, I imagine, where Games Workshop is going to try to push the faction instead of being these like weird kind of xenomorph-esque amalgamations of Gene Stealers with some guns, with some really fast flying elements that feel more like an Eldari army. I think Games Workshop is probably going to try to push the faction to be more Horde style, and I imagine a secondary like that would probably be one of the ways that they would try to make that happen. Talking about some unit-specific profiles. One thing I'd like to note is that Games Workshop doesn't tend to take units that are kind of at a static point and give them a big glow up. They tend to pick a couple units or unit archetypes and really make those the focus of a particular codex. And a lot of times those are either new units or units that they can, re-release kits for and re-release support for. And with that in mind, if you are hollering for a rework to your favorite unit, it might not be the time. I'm highly doubtful that something like Carnifexes or Gene Stealers get a big rework to suddenly be amazing in the new codex, given that they've been around forever. Everybody already has them. And a lot of times those old school units, kind of fall by the wayside and are eventually forgotten. Like, how long has it been since Land Raiders and Space Marines were good? Land Raiders are incredible. Everyone has a Land Raider somewhere in their closet. Everyone likes them. They're very cool. They're very iconic. But Games Workshop's not incentivized to push them in the codex. So I think that's going to be a similar thing for any Tyranid codex. If you want a bunch of Carnifexes, you want your Carnifexes to be good. Given that they didn't get any look in the January FAQ whatsoever, I'm not 100% sure that... We'll see. I might be wrong about that, but I think it's good for everyone to temper their expectations. A new codex is going to fix them. For the little guys, I have to imagine that, especially given the treatment that they got in the January FAQ, and let's be honest, I don't think Games Workshop changes points in an FAQ to then sort of entirely retarget their focus. And given that Warriors got an enormous buff in that FAQ, I think the age of the Warrior is upon us, ladies and gentlemen. Also, I mean, Warriors are like a really good value for point on Games Workshop's end. They don't cost that much on the tabletop, but the kits themselves are expensive. So it may just be that it's a good place to push people in the faction. I don't know. Maybe we're tinfoil hatting a little bit too much here. One thing I would like to see and half expect to see is Unyielding Chitin baked into their profile. Games Workshop is giving away static -1 damage like it's candy, and I think Warriors are probably going to be a recipient of that. I also have to assume that they're going to be going to a 3+ ballistic skill base and potentially have better melee weapons. I would like to see some multi-damage bone swords, maybe. That'd be cool. Bone sword 2 damage. Let's see it. Hopefully we make it happen. I also have to imagine that across the board, Scything Talons probably get a little bit of a bump. It's kind of annoying that the base Tyranid infantry that's supposed to be melee oriented has no AP value and typically low strength, which makes them terrible in melee. I think if Scything Talons get a +1 AP bump, I think that would go a long way to help and make them feel a little bit more lethal in combat. So I imagine that's what we see. The fact that warriors are often depicted and sort of pushed as being a ranged shooting unit, but then are actually terrible at shooting, kind of flies in the face of what they're supposed to be conceptually. And I have to imagine that Games Workshop will probably go a long way to trying to get them back to that point. So probably a buff in ballistic skill, and then maybe even an additional bump from the alpha. On the note of making the swarmier and more classic Tyranid units a little bit more powerful, I have to imagine we get a Poxwalker style regeneration strat for the smaller stuff. Maybe Gants, but maybe also Rippers. Poxwalkers, in their codex, they roll 7 d6s, and on a 3+, you get a Poxwalker back. Nurglings have something very similar, and I think that's a shoo-in for the swarmy units in the Tyranid Codex. You could also tie that into Turvagons as well. Maybe instead of a Turvagon regenerating models or creating new units that you have to pay points for, which is annoying and stupid, the Turvagon could instead just give you that strat for free if it targets a unit within 6 inches or something like that. You know, sort of a Chief Apothecary style. I think that would make a ton of sense to me and be relatively powerful. I have to imagine Games Workshop's probably going to be trying to lean away from the Green Tide style strats. I know a lot of people have hoped that Endless Swarm became more of a useful strat. Instead of regenerating a dead unit, you just Endless Swarmed a unit from below half back to full off a table edge. That it's kind of an NPE of a strat. So I imagine that these horde armies that are relying on regenerating their units in that way, you know, Black Cornucopians and Unstoppable Green Tide and Tide of Traders, those moved closer towards being a slower burn, I guess, where the unit just regenerates a couple models every turn for 1 CP instead of being 3 CP for like the entire unit. Zoanthropes, I think, are an interesting question as well while we're talking about these small infantry. I think that, as a lot of people have said in the past, it's unlikely that they keep their 3+ invulnerable save. Games Workshop's trying to really push away the high invulnerable saves. They're trying to make 2+ invulnerable save almost impossible, if not strictly impossible, outside of Drukhari. And they're making the 3+ invulnerable saves very situational. So, you know, Space Marines have essentially only Armor Indomitus, I think, is almost the only way to get a 3+ invulnerable save, whereas they used to be like the 3+ invulnerable save poster boys. That said, Zoanthropes are probably pretty useless without their 3+ invulnerable save. Given that their point cost increased in the January FAQ, I'm not 100% sure Games Workshop really cares. They may just have switch their focus from Zoanthropes, and they're not meant to be the focus of this particular codex. So if they move to a 4+ invulnerable save and they keep all of their same stats and point costs, they're probably going to be unplayable. That said, I would like to see a rework of the unit, maybe make them a little bit easier to kill, but switch them to a role less of a support psyker that sometimes does like a cool smite every once in a while, to more of a Devastator squad, where they come in, they're relatively fragile, but they do a bunch of damage in kind of close range shooting. Imagine like a Grav Cannon Devastator squad, for example. And that's the role that Zoanthropes used to play way back in the day. They used to have a relatively short-range psychic power that was an incredibly powerful anti-tank weapon, and I'd like to see something similar like that come back. Don't make them super hard to kill. Super hard to kill isn't super fun, but make it so that they can come in a Tyrannocyte. You know, you can pop them in off strategic reserve. They zap something to death, and then maybe they die afterwards. I think that would be an interesting direction to go for the unit. Neurothropes, if they go to a 4+ invulnerable, but they don't really change that much otherwise, are probably still good. The 3+ invulnerable in those guys sometimes feels superfluous. Like, not only are they a support caster that also deals damage and heals your guys, but then also are randomly like really difficult to kill and tank smash captains pretty often. So I think you can do a lot to Neurothropes and they'll still be playable. I think the worst thing they could do is drop Neurothropes to 1 cast. They would probably be less useful at that point, but I don't think that that's a particular danger. Talking about the big bugs now, one thing I think we can expect, given all of the releases in 9th edition so far, are big buffs to damage profiles. We've seen so many weapons from elsewhere in the game move from damage D6 or damage 3 to damage D3 plus 3. And I think that is probably a direction that the faction's going to be going in from now on. I'd be super surprised if we don't see enormous buffs to weapons like Monstrous Scything Talons, which are right now damage D6, but could move to D3+3, and I think probably will move to D3+3. Rupture cannons are D6 damage and strength 10. It seems clear that they're going to try to make them, las cannon plus, which is that D3+3 laser destroyer style profile. I think we probably see something like that, and also crushing claws probably move to, a D3+3 or maybe flat 4 damage. I think that would be good as well. I also would not be surprised if across the board we saw melee focused monsters net enormous buffs to their melee profiles. +1 strength, +1 attack seems like it would bring them in line with a lot of the other similar units that we're seeing in the metagame right now. A Dreadnought punches the crap out of any Tyranid monster you can bring against it and also outshoots it, and that's just not cool. So I have to imagine that we see the Tyranid monsters come in with more attacks with better weapons. They're just so incredibly outclassed right now because of the age of their codex that I expect that we'll start to see a lot more Dimacron-style profiles coming out of a new codex. With that in mind, I think a lot of the ranged weapons probably get a little bit of a retool as well. Impaler cannons are almost assured to move to 2 damage, which I think will be a really big nerf to the Hive Guard unit. Probably a reason that we see the Hive Guard point cost reduced. D3 damage is almost strictly better in the current metagame because there's so much -1 damage reduction from Dreadnoughts to Death Guard, and being flat 2 damage is just terrible. It's just really bad. So that would be, I think, an appropriate nerf to Hive Guard. Maybe they see some other changes as well, but we'll have to see. It seems to me also that a lot of situational hit bonuses are getting baked directly into a unit's profile. So something like the Mephitic Blightholler, which got +1 to hit if you had 3 models in the unit, just became Ballistic Skill 3 instead, and I imagine we start to see that across the game. So there's not so many bizarre interactions with the unit getting +1 to hit and then multiple minuses to hit. You don't have to do all that math in your head every time you do a thing. And that would mean that something like an Exocrine would go to 3+ Ballistic Skill flat. I don't think that's a huge change, since I imagine that exploding 6s off Symbiostorm will change to be unmodified 6s explode anyway, so there wouldn't be a synergy there. But outside of that one situation, it's actually a strict buff, because not giving yourself +1 to hit means that multiple -1s to hit don't negatively affect you. I also would like to see Tyrannifexes at a 3+ Ballistic Skill. That unit is terrible at shooting for some reason, and I think that is probably a shoo-in if they want to make Tyrannifexes better. And we did see Tyrannifexes go down in the January FAQ in point cost, so I think it's likely that they get a little bit of a looking at. Speaking of those two units together as well, I would really like to see them use the same mechanics. So maybe they're both at a 3+ Ballistic Skill. Both of them have the same rule to let them double shoot when they stand still, or maybe they get a Lehman Russ style rule where they move half and then they double shoot, for example. But then you use a strat like Symbiotic Devastation to affect both of the data sheets. I think that would put Tyrannifexes in the discussion alongside Exocrines as a pretty decent shooting platform. Right now, Exocrines just have so much support, and Tyrannifexes have none, and it's obnoxious, honestly. We have this whole data sheet with a bunch of interesting guns on it that are basically useless. I'd like to see it on the table. So let's see a little glow up for the Tyrannifex, and I have to imagine that that's coming. On that note as well, I think I'd like to see Venom Cannons get a retool, maybe a higher damage value. I'd like to see flat 3 shots with AP3. I think that would be interesting. You got a lot of 3s going on. Strength 9, 3 shots, AP3 for 3 damage. We got the multiples. I love it. But I don't know if I can really conjecture about something that's specific this far out. But anyway, I think that's some interesting things to think about when it comes to Tyranids. Tyranids are an interesting faction to consider because the age of the 8th edition codex works both for and against it. We have interactions like Metabolic Overdrive giving you the ability to perform actions, which is clearly unintended and a result of a brand new mechanic coming in out of 9th edition. But also, we have all of these old profiles with old versions of their weapons that are just terrible and do not shake up with the current metagame. So I think a full redesign of the faction, even if not too many things change, but if more of the data sheets just become more interesting and playable, I think it could be a really interesting time for Tyranids. Honestly, I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I'm not super excited for a Tyranid redesign. I think the faction's at a really good point right now, and it's really interesting to play. It's relatively fragile, but it plays a very highly mobile game and can play a very powerful control game, and I think that's a cool place for it to be. It doesn't really work conceptually. Like a Tyranid army in a tournament does not look anything like Games Workshop would want a Tyranid army to look like, which is a problem, I think, for the design team. But, I'm okay with that. I'll play my Hive Guard and my Dimacrons all I want. But anyway, it's going to be interesting to see how it goes. It looks like we're going to see the new Orc Codex as the next Xenos Codex after Drukhari. That's what the scuttlebutt says and all the evidence is pointing to. But the fact that Tyranids got a looking at in the January FAQ says to me that there are eyes on the faction and that we may see a new codex sometime within the next couple months. Anyway, let me know down in the comments what you think about a new Tyranid Codex, what you would like to see in it. Also, like and subscribe to the video and the channel respectively. That really helps in the algorithm and all that stuff. And last but not least, big thanks to everyone who supports the channel over on the YouTube membership, as well as on Patreon, patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. All those folks are sweet. They get early access to videos, and they can vote on new video topics, stuff like that. If you are interested in T5S2 Season 3, which we literally just started, they also get early access to tournament pods, so that's awesome. Anyway, thanks again for watching, everybody. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.